There's been a lot of discourse in intellectual circles and in the mainstream about parenting and children. A lot of ink spilt, a lot of words stated. But the one thing that remains constant is what the scriptures have to teach about the parental roles over their children. A lot of Christian parents are taught what the Proverbs teach, that children come into the world with foolishness attached to them, to their neck, some would say, and that with the rod of correction, you will distance it, you will depart it from them, and that this rod of correction should not be withheld lest you spoil the child. Furthermore, it states in the Proverbs that you're not going to kill your child if you use that rod of correction. However, being in the age that we're living in, secularists have pointed out, quote unquote, that said texts are overly vulgar, totalitarian, and unfair. And therefore, we need to one up the Bible because this is just downright cruel. And what does that lead us to? A society in which the young do not respect the old, a society in which the young don't have any moral compass, a society which is busting apart at the seams via its degradation and degeneration. Because parents, not wanting to be the dictators over their children's lives, because they were emotionally unfit to educate their children, have led us to a place where all of these things are true and more. This is an observation that your average Christian, whom follows what the scriptures has to teach, will notice. But now there is a Yale University law professor whom is stating that these very young people, yes, the very same whom I'm not saying all, I have to clarify that, but generally speaking, the very same youth whom were not educated by their parents in the first place, were not taught good moral principles in the first place, their vote should in fact carry more weight than that of their parents, even though their parents have more skin in the game economically, politically, and whatnot in the country's future. More on that shortly. Welcome each and every one of you to this new live stream of Irrespective. This is a topic that no matter how I approach it, no matter which way I approach it, there's always going to be those whom say amen and yes. And there are those that, even Christians, when you speak the biblical truth on the matter, they will push back against the simplest stated biblical applications, Christian principles on the matter, because they are more in tune with what secularism teaches about raising children, if you can call that raising children, instead of applying what the text has to tell us about parents educating their children. Every time I approach one of these subject matters, it's like clockwork. It ends up happening. And I'm going to continue to disseminate the truth of the matter because God's word does not return to him void. And I'm always going to take the side of God's word because, number one, he is the creator. He knows how his creation works best. He knows how he designed it to work optimally. And number two, to point out secularism's flaws in the face of what Christian principles teach us about how parents have to educate their children in the discipline and the admonition of the Lord. That does not fail if you do it properly. But a lot of Christian parents end up failing because they would rather go with whatever the mainstream teaches about rearing children, which, as I've said before, is not in fact rearing children. It's actually leaving them to the system so the system can rear them. And they'll say, as long as I take them to church once a week for 45 minutes, that'll be more than enough biblical, so-called education to form them properly. And then they send them off to school, they send them off to colleges, and then these children return back to them, sounding more and more like God haters than anything else. So it's a topic that is near and dear to my heart. I will continue to talk about it. And today's edition will not be any different based on what this Yale law professor had to say to a New York Times columnist in a recent podcast. Anyways, housekeeping items. If you haven't done so yet, we would encourage you to subscribe, to hit that notification bell, to click that thumbs up button, and to share our content with others. Of course, if you're on X, there is no thumbs up button, but a like on the post. Nevertheless, the nomenclature may be different, but please click on that like button. And if you're watching this through YouTube or Rumble and you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit that notification bell to be alerted as to when we post our content, when we go live, which is consistently on Wednesdays, 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and on Sundays at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Don't forget to interact with me by placing your questions and or comments in the chat. We're watching all of them, X, YouTube, or Rumble. Also, don't forget to donate. It helps us to continue to keep the lights on here and Irrespective and do what we do, which is irrespective of what the discourse is, what the thought process is, what the popular consensus on a matter is. We will speak the Christian ethical truth to the matter because that is the ultimate truth. So donate. It helps us to keep the lights on here. QR code, you'll see it on the upper left-hand corner of the screen. Conversely, you can tap or click, depending on the device you're using to watch this transmission, in the link that we have available for you in the description box beneath the video player. Last but not least, do not forget to follow us on the socials. On X, you can follow us or find us by looking up the username Irrespective77. And on TikTok, you can find us under the username The Irrespective. All right. This is New York Times columnist, if I'm not mistaken, and if I'm not mispronouncing his name, Ross Douthat, interviewing Yale law professor Samuel Moyn. I'll play the clip for you first, and then I will return to, or rather, I might pause intermittently and comment on the matter. It's a short clip. I might just let the whole thing play first, and then we'll repeat it. Let's see.
I've gotten in some hot water for proposing we consider overweighting the votes of younger people or assigning the youngest eligible voters proxy votes for the unrepresented children of our country. So those are edgy.
Why not assign them to those children's parents?
Well, because there's a divergence of interest between parents and children. And I think it's likelier that young people, not people who are raising families, will have the best insight into the interests of children. Whereas if you were awarded 5
I think
proxy
that's
votes,
daft. I think it's absurd to imagine that a 24-year-old recent college graduate has a better assessment of the interests of my own children than I do. I say this with all due respect to 24-year-old recent college graduates, of whom I hope to be the parent of in 9 years or so.
I think parents generally confuse the interests of their family with the interests of their children. And part of our goal, I think, as parents, but also as a society, is trying to make sure that children aren't the hostages of their parents, as much as we rely on parents to raise them.
In my experience, parents are more likely to be.
There's a lot to unpack there. It's a short 1 minute and 20-second clip, as you have seen. I'll scrub it all the way back to the beginning, and we'll take it point by point, because this in and of itself merits closer scrutiny. One thing I'd like to point out, and a general comment associated with what you've just heard, something else I'd like to mention about this. Number one, you'll notice that there is an awful lot of euphemistic language used by this Yale law professor. This is very similar to the tactics used by persons whom propose ideas that are generally harmful for society if society were to adopt them or were to be imposed on them. Think politicians, Yale law professors, university professors, council members of local commissions, et cetera, et cetera. Notice that the language that they necessarily employ is not one where they will say in a straightforward manner what it is that they are proposing. They have to use a loaded, hefty, and oftentimes nebulous or euphemistic language to make their ideas, what they are proposing, not only sound legitimate, but helpful. Something that would aid the populace. because they know that if they were to otherwise state it in plain language, most people would balk, recoil at the thought of what it is that they are proposing. And they use this sort of verbosity to try to fly over the heads of people whom are not, they don't speak this way. Remember, these are so-called intellectuals having this discussion with one another. And therefore, the average person whom doesn't speak this way won't pick up on what it is that Professor Moyne is advocating for here. Some will say that I've just stated that there are very many people amongst us that are just that stupid, that unlearned, that they won't be able to understand what he's proposing. Well, I'm not going to apologize for what I've just said, because there are very many people in our midst that they wouldn't be able to understand what he's proposing. And that's the very reason why he's using that sort of language, so as to fly over the heads of many people who won't understand. So don't take issue with me. Take issue with him. He's the machinator. He's the demagogue. I'm just warning you to what the tactic is here and why he's using this sort of language, try to anesthetize people to what it is that he is proposing. But this is typical of people like Moyne and others, that when they have something, they want to popularize something, start a movement in a culture, in a society, in a country that generally is damaging and would negatively affect many people. This is the sort of whitewashed language, euphemistic language that they will use when they say one thing, but in fact they mean another. Because if you've heard correctly, what he just said was he's willing to disenfranchise the votes of older Americans in favor of, he used the word weighting the votes of the younger generation, because they have a better outlook on life than the older generation. Now, again, there's a lot to unpack here, and we'll do so in short order. But I'd like to read to the audience some background, give you some background on who Samuel Moyne is. One of these things is going to make a lot of sense. Let's put it that way. I'm reading from his Wikipedia page. Samuel Aaron Moyne, M-O-Y-N, born 1972, is the Chancellor Kent Professor of Law and History at Yale University. Remember, Yale University is one of those Ivy League schools that was commenced in the United States for the express purpose of training ministers and law, or shall we say attorneys at law. And it's devolved into having these sorts of creatures rummaging around campus. Previously, the Henry R. Luce Professor of Jurisprudence at Yale Law School and Professor of History at Yale University, which he joined in July 2017. He was a Professor of History at Columbia University for 13 years and a Professor of History and of Law at Harvard University for 3 years. When you are, let me explain something to the audience. When you're a tenured professor for that long at Columbia University, which is one of the most progressive, meaning leftist universities in the United States, you know what kind of a person you're talking about here. There aren't very many registered Republican, without them making that public knowledge, as it were, professors at Columbia University. His research interests are in modern European intellectual history, with special interests in France and Germany, political and legal thought, historical and critical theory. See where he's coming from? And Jewish studies. What is this? Some people might be asking. Jewish studies. What does this have to? Well, when you look under personal life, Moyne was married to Elisa Anna Berger in 2003. His parents are Anita Hutkin of St. Louis and John Moyne of Newark, Delaware. Moyne is Jewish. Some will say, yeah, that tracks. That makes a lot of sense. When you look at the voting patterns of Jews generally in the United States, upwards of 80% of them are progressive. They're liberals. So this tracks that a guy of this, shall we say, ethnicity and bent would actually promote this very thing. So going back to the statements that Moyne made, we're going to scrub through the video And I'm going to pause it intermittently to comment because each individual point needs to be scrutinized.
I've gotten in some hot water for proposing we
You think?
consider overweighting the votes of younger people or assigning the youngest eligible voters proxy votes for the unrepresented children of our country.
Notice that what he's trying to do, he's trying to advocate that the youngest voters, those whom enter into voting age, their votes should count more than the votes of the older population. There's an essential problem here that needs to be addressed, by the way. A side note before I get to that. This is one of the issues that democracy begets. A lot of conservative Christians, they continue to think, according to whatever mainstream Republican Party talking points advance, that we are still somehow a constitutional republic based, although somewhat loosely nowadays, on the country that our founders gave us. We are no longer a constitutional republic. This is more, as I mentioned recently in a Telegram post, an oligarchical technopoly that is slowly but surely hollowing out the middle class because of various reasons. Government expenditures, increased government tyranny over the life and daily issues pertaining to the country. The laws that have been passed in the interim from the founding to now with respect to changing in voting patterns and laws and the Civil Rights Act, all of these things necessarily have turned us into a technological oligarchy, wherein also they're trying to, and they've tried to peddle the idea of a democracy. One man, one vote, 51% gets to dictate what the policies going forward will be. Here's the problem. That's not what the founders created. By my reading of what the founders had envisioned, if not all of them, most of them thought that democracy was a bad idea. Jefferson called it the tyranny of the simple majority. Not only that, people like Hans Hermann Hoppe, in his book, highly recommended, Democracy, the God That Failed, he notes that democracy, it actually encourages demagogic politicians whom they strive to reach for votes for the lowest common denominator. What is it that you want? I'll give you that so long as you give me your vote. And it encourages people whom are the most salacious and unsavory characters, the least trustworthy persons amongst us, to run for office, promising people things so long as they have access to power and money. That is what democracy encourages, and that's what we have currently in the United States. It doesn't matter whether you vote Democrat or Republican. I think a lot of people have woken up to that you're just looking at a political class that is trying to get ahead for themselves at the expense of the country and its people. But going back to the point here of what he states, so note that in that system that it has devolved to, now no longer a constitutional republic, but a democracy, he wants to give more weight to the votes of younger persons than older persons. Here's an essential problem with that under a democracy when you think about it. Like I said earlier, this is one of those issues that democracy brings forth because that's the system that is currently in place in the United States. You have a bunch of people whom have been paying taxes for the longest time. Many of them are property owners. Many of them have been paying into the system for the longest of times. They have more skin in the game, as it were. And I get it. We're not talking about every able-bodied adult. I understand that there's a lot of people in our society that are more takers than givers. My last study on the matter, my last research on the matter is that approximately 45 to 47%, and the number may have even diminished in the last few years, of the American population are taxpayers, meaning that you have a majority of people in this country that are actually takers, not givers. I've said it before, and some people have been bothered by the fact that I've said it. We are a socialist country. No matter what the talking points, the President Trumps of life and others will say, we are technically a socialist country. No country has the laws that we have on the books, in maybe except for a couple of European countries, that has such a large Leviathan welfare state like we do, to the point where the minority is having to keep the majority afloat. And in many instances, not for anything like a disability, but just for outright laziness, for outright not having any intention to improve on their lot in life. That's a fact. A lot of politicians won't say that because they won't get elected. Remember, democracy. You can't say that to voters unless they withhold their vote, even the most taker of takers, if that makes any sense. But now you've got a guy here whom is proposing a system wherein the youngest, they don't have the same skin in the game as older adults have in this country, and their vote is going to weigh more than older people. Look, let me try to simplify this for the audience. If you haven't noticed yet, in the United States, it's been like this for some time now, decades even. The younger you are, the more progressive, the more liberal, the more impressionable you are. And this guy, obviously being a Marxist, a cultural Marxist, he would prefer to give that weighting to younger people because it works out for the policies that he prefers, specifically those promoted by the Democrat Party and its proxies. That's the only reason that he's doing this. Don't try to make this more intellectual than what he himself is trying to present it as, to cover the real intentionality behind this. He's trying to peddle the idea of Pelosi. You'll remember Nancy Pelosi. She said that a few years ago when she was Speaker of the House, that we should lower the voting age to 16. It's because these people, these liberals, generally know that the younger you are, the more progressive you are. So it gives them more opportunities to have power compared to their opponents. Just keep that in mind. That's the only reason he's pushing this. But he is trying to present it as, in essence, younger people are technically wiser. Notice how he says they have a better outlook on the world than older people. Wait, what? That inverts the biblical order by 180 degrees. Allow me to explain. The Bible very clearly states that the way that God created humanity, it's supposed to be a laddering effect, if I can use that term, is that phrase is permitted me. What I mean by that is that parents are supposed to engender in their children knowledge, respect, wisdom, all of the things necessary for them to mature and then become full-fledged adults. And then they can become full, responsible participants in society. It is the parents' responsibility to do that. But that order has been inverted in the United States and across the West during the last 100 years, wherein via words like this salacious individual is advancing, where they advance the idea that youth, they know more than the old. Now, I get it. Some will say, well, Gio, if you look at the particulars, there are quite a lot of older people that really are not that mature. I understand that, but we're speaking in generalities here. Besides, I'm trying to frame this in the sense of what the Bible advocates for, what Christian principles, Christian ethics are advancing. The parents are supposed to educate their children. That, just by simple process of deduction, leads you to understand something that is common sense. A person has lived more, hence, they should have more experience than the young. And therefore, since they have more experience, they should be able to teach that to the young. You find the same principle noted in Titus. When Paul writes to this young pastor, he says, let the older gentlemen teach the younger men, and let the older women teach the younger women. It's a biblical principle through and through. That is the moral, familial order that God established. But since we have been so adept at adopting secularism for the last few decades in the West and throwing off the so-called shackles of Christianity that founded the West, these are the sorts of lunacies that get promoted under the guise of equality, fairness. They'll use those terms. They'll always frame it in moral discourse. But in fact, what they're trying to promote is more a political outcome so that people like this will get their preferred policies put in place. It's nothing more than machination dressed up as intellectual, or shall I say, or nothing more dressed up as a new way of doing things. That's all that's going on here. But more than anything else, and of course, this would have really nasty effects in the country. Aside from this, it would further degrade the order that used to be understood and kept to in the country up until around 100 years ago, especially after industrialization became a thing. We used to be an agrarian society. Jefferson wrote often, and he's one of my favorite founders for this. He had his ideas with which I vehemently disagree. But one of the things that I think he inherently understood, and I would encourage you to read his writings on that, is that as long as America kept its agrarian roots, the spirit of independence would pervade. That makes a lot of sense. If you are depending on your own labor to cultivate, harvest your own food and your own sustenance, you are going to be a person whom wants and desires independence. The less that happens, the more you become dependent on the system or systems to feed you, clothe you, bathe you, whatever the case may be, the less independent minded you are. Jefferson got it right. Only a people that have become so acclimated to the decadence that we have in the United States would think of advancing such an idea. Only a people that have been so distanced from that lifestyle, as it were, to the one that we're currently going through now, would think of proposing something like this. So, Gio, are you saying, some will ask, are you saying that necessarily because we've been removed from that thought process, that we used to have in the country, that in and of itself has led us against these Christian values? Absolutely. I've said it before. There's a reason why there's a massive return to the land movement happening in the United States now. A lot of people are discontented where things are. They see what is generating this, and they're saying, wait a minute, I think we need a change because this system is not going to last too much longer. Can you imagine if the adults in the room now, and it may sound like I'm contradicting myself here, because in one sense I'm defending those that are older, but in the other sense I'm also pointing out, and it's not contradictory, because I'm trying to point out that the biblical ethic, the Christian ethic, teaches one thing, but it doesn't necessarily mean that all adults in our midst are behaving as they should. Those two things can be true at the same time. When you look at the behavior of the adults in the room now, you ask yourself the question, you kind of arrive at the conclusion, like, I see where we're at. I see why we're at. Because of this. And then you've got this guy who comes along and is trying to talk into the lives of the young people. They don't care for you. They're all decadent. They don't really care about the younger generations. Your vote should weigh more than theirs. He's speaking to a people whom, when they sit in class, they're being propagandized every single minute they're in these classrooms and told you're more intelligent than the older generation. And that younger generation now becomes enthralled with how big their head has gotten by what their professors are telling them. And they say, yeah, why shouldn't our votes count more? And then you've, in fact, got the blind leading the blind, whether it be immature adults, machinating adults just like this, and those who think that they know more than they do. It's akin to what Jesus described as the blind leading the blind into the ditch. That is the current system that we have in the United States now. When people like this, a supposed grown adult, is advocating for this in the midst of the problems that we currently have now. Now, some of you might be asking, Gio, but you've described the malaise, the issues surrounding the country now, and all the problems. What are we Christians to do about it? This is why I began with what I started this live stream episode with. This is a topic that no matter which way I approach it, I'll always find that there are Christian parents, self-proclaimed Christian parents, that when I teach these things, when I try to inform them of these things, they balk, they recoil, and then they start shooting the messenger. And I tell them, no, the problem is that you're comfy in the system that you participate in. You prefer that system, and that's why you end up denouncing the very messenger of what Christian ethics advances. I don't see anywhere in the scripture, and I would make a bet, I would wager with anyone to be able to find that for me in the scripture, where it says that the state has the responsibility to raise your children in your stead. Find it for me. I want you to find that text for me. Where in the Bible, where in Christian ethics, where in the gospel do you find a permission for Christians to offload their responsibility to rear their children in the admonition of the Lord to the state? The very state, by the way, that wants to take advantage of their immaturity so that they can leverage their votes to power, just like this guy is advocating for. I'll wait. You're going to lose that wager 100 times out of 100. But the thing is that the system, the way that it's set up now, it's designed to incentivize you sending your children off to the system so that the system will mold and shape them, not the way that God designed it, where you are supposed to be the primary educators, primary molders, shapers of your children's minds, thoughts, behaviors, patterns, what have you. If you think you can find the opposite in the text, I'll wager the money you're not going to be able to win that one. But a lot of parents, and I've heard the excuses, but in this economy, you need a 2-parent income. And I get all of that. I've already talked about at length, ad nauseum, about how they've set up the system. The people whom have set up the system have done so intentionally to make it difficult to return back to that point, but it can be done. That's what I'm trying to get at. It can be done if you have a little incentive, a little determination, a little perseverance. Things can be done still, yes, even in this country, to achieve that. But the thing is that people will they would rather place excuses than actually put the persistence, the determination, the plan in place to do better for themselves and their families. There's no excuse. None whatsoever.
So those are edgy.
Why not assign them to those children's parents?
Well, because there's a divergence of interest between parents.
Listen, he knows that generally, and the polls continue to show this, the older you are, the more conservative you tend to be. So all he wants is that a younger demographic outvoting, as it were, the older demographic so that he gets his preferred policies in place. That's what this all is. But he's using intellectualist language to give you the impression that that's not what he wants, that he's coming at this more from a moral standpoint. Hogwash.
And children. And I think it's likelier that young people, not people who are raising.
What is it with these people? Like this guy here. They're married. They're supposedly heterosexual. I find that they always have this effeminate way to them. What is it with these people? I've noticed this especially in a lot of Jewish communities. A lot of the Jewish groups. A lot of these guys are raised by their mothers, and they talk like Jewish American princesses, as it were. Oh my goodness! All the moil.
Families will have the best insight into the
Oy vey!
interests of children, whereas if you were awarded 5
I think
proxy
that's
votes,
daft. I think it's absurd to imagine.
He just stated that, in essence, parents are not going to have their children's best interest in mind. Now, in certain instances, I'm not going to argue that that's not the case. There's a lot of bad parents out there. I've said it over and over again. But please remember what the agenda is here. He'll use that to leverage it to give points or more weight to what he's proposing, but it's still ludicrous.
That a 24-year-old recent college graduate has a better assessment of the interests of.
And I've also said this before, because when they talk about people whom recently graduated and they're in their early 20s and whatnot, I would challenge a lot of these modern 20-year-olds that graduate with bachelor degrees and whatnot to take up some of the tests and answer those tests that were being administered to 12 and 13-year-olds about 150 years ago in the country. They wouldn't be able to pass those tests. These people were already practically full-fledged adults by the age of 13, 14. well trained, good thoughts, mature beyond their years. Today's 24-year-old cannot hold a candle to the 18th century 13-year-old. It's not going to happen. Just research it and you'll find what I'm saying is true.
Of my own children than I do.
And
I say this with all due respect to 24-year-old recent college
Notice
graduates.
the smugness. Notice the smugness of this college professor when he says to him, "I want what's best for my children." Who are these other people to tell me that I don't want what's best for my children? Rightfully said. And this guy, the college professor, starts to scoff. In other words, he's telling him right to his face that you, as a parent, you don't have what's your children's best interest in mind. The smugness of these guys.
Whom I hope to be the parent of in 9 years or so.
I think parents generally confuse the interests of their family with the interests of their children.
What? You have to be this smart, so-called, to be this stupid. That phrase makes no sense. If you genuinely, sincerely care for your children's well-being, then that is also going to reflect in the way that others raise their children. If you employ Christian principles to raise your children, you want that also deployed to other children because those principles are universal. What sort of stupidity did this guy just say? But yet he's a Harvard law professor. He's a Yale law professor. He was at Columbia University. This guy's the smartest of the smart. No, he's a charlatan.
And part of our goal, I think, as parents, but also as a society, is trying to make sure that children aren't the hostages of their parents.
That's cultural Marxism right there. Children aren't the hostages of the parents. He said it all there. If you read the Communist Manifesto for the country that was published in the 1940s, it was published by Leon Skousen and others in the 1940s. The Communist Goals for America, published in the 1940s. One of the goals, their stated goals, is to turn children against their parents. This guy is a cultural Marxist. It doesn't surprise me that he's ethnically Jewish because Jews, generally speaking, in the United States are very, very liberal. So it doesn't surprise me that he advances that. Some of you might think, that's racist. Well, I don't care if you think that. It's just a fact. How do we fight against this? Well, I'm going to tell you something, and it might be overly pessimistic on my part. I think the country is headed for a very, very dire place. There's so many things that can be noted much longer than the time I have available here to talk about the degradation that is happening in the country and where I ultimately think it will lead, although I have mentioned it in other podcasts or live streams. But I think what you need to do is to establish a mindset in your mind of building in an ark, similar to Noah, for your family. One thing that Christian parents don't do, and the simplest thing that they can do to begin to turn the tide in their children's lives, is to have daily involvement in their children's lives. So let's say you're a parent that does a 9 to 5 and you send your child to public school and whatnot. How many parents actually take the time when they get home from work and the children get home from school to actually sit down and talk about what was taught at school and try to deprogram those children from the lies that their professors are telling them? Not too many. I know a lot of Christians will tell me, I did that. The evidence is not necessarily there. Otherwise, it would have demonstrated it. How many parents actually take the time to become involved in their children's lives? I'm not talking about taking them to soccer practice or anything like that. I'm talking about sincere involvement in rearing those children, being involved, directly involved in their children's lives, intellectually. When was the last time you'll see parents, for example, telling their children, hey, read this book, and I'll read it with you. Hey, have you thought about this? Did you see this? Let's talk about this. That's not something that most parents do with their children because it's not something that American society practices. So when we get home, everybody goes to their particular space inside of the house. And they call that rearing. That's not rearing. That's not involvement. In order to turn the tide, that needs to change. We need to go back to a model, a Christian ethical model that teaches that there is direct involvement in the lives of our children. Simple conversations go a long way to this. Instead of blasting the music in the car, have conversations about these topics, open, honest conversations about these things. And if your children hold objectionable views, and by objectionable, I mean things that go contrary to what the text teaches, debate them on it. Do it civilly. Prove to them that there's a better way to see things and that their professors are lying to them. Show them that their parents have better interests in their mind about them than these nobodies. And they are nobodies. I find it interesting that Christians trust the state in these instances. They'll trust the teachers, they'll trust the cops, they'll trust the politicians, people they don't know, because the state says that they're licensed. Yeah, and what does that mean? You don't know these people. You don't know what they're carrying in their hearts. If COVID taught us one thing, it's that there's a lot of people in the system that are more than ready to poison the lives, the minds of children. Amazingly, it took that for parents to figure that out. And yet they're still learning that lesson. That's number one. Involve yourself in your children's lives. Number two, make a way where you can be financially independent so that you can take control of your family's daily activities to the point where you have flexibility in your schedule and you don't have to send your children to the system, but instead you become responsible for what your children learn so that you have the direct access, the direct influence in your children's lives. God's word does not return to him void. It tells us in the Old Testament that if you train a child in the way that he will go, he will not depart from it. That tells you that the early years are important. Form them, shape them, mold them according to Christian principles. Thirdly, if you're a parent that says, well, my children are kind of advanced in age, but I didn't have that involvement in their lives, start having it. You'd be surprised how open and how receptive your children will be because their parent is taking an interest in their existence. There are going to be barriers, of course, placed there by secular society and their indulgence in it, but not something that a little Christian wisdom can't overcome. And of course, every child and every family is particular in that, particular tendencies, et cetera, but those can be overcome. As long as you ask the good Lord for wisdom in that and how to speak into your child's life, into your children's lives, all will be better for it. That's the view that you have to have. Lest people like this guy that we just profiled, they are the ones that speak into your children's minds and hearts. They contaminate it, and then you end up asking yourself, what happened? Where did it go so wrong? When you've got sharks in the water like this, you don't throw your children into that water, lest they be consumed by these ravagers. Keep that in mind. That's all the time I have left for this edition of the live stream. A couple of items before I sign off. Please do not forget to subscribe, to hit that notification bell, to click that thumbs up, and to share our content with others if it edifies you. I'll remind the audience that our next live stream will be on Sunday at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Don't forget to donate. It helps us to keep the lights on here. You can scan the QR code on the screen. Conversely, you can follow the link that's available to you in the description box below. And last but not least, do not forget to follow us on the socials. Irrespective 77 is our username on X. And on TikTok, you can follow us there under the username The Irrespective. That's all the time I have left for this edition. Until the next occasion that we gather, adieu and Godspeed.